Welcome to this explainer. Today we're doing something I find absolutely fascinating. We're going to systematically zoom all the way in, from those massive multi-trillion-dollar metrics that define whole nations, right down to the incredibly quirky flaws of human decision-making. It's a journey from the macro measurement to the micro mindset, and I promise you it's going to completely change how you look at the financial news.
So here's our quick roadmap for today. First, we'll decode gross domestic product, then map out the circular flow model, break down the expenditure approach, look at some global comparisons and alternatives, and finally end up at heuristics and human impact. All right, section 1. Let's decode gross domestic product. So you hear about it all the time on the news, but what actually is GDP? The textbook definition is that it's the market value of all final goods and services produced within a nation's geographic borders during a specific period of time. Basically, it's our ultimate economic speedometer. But the absolutely crucial part here is geographic borders. GDP is totally obsessed with local domestic activity and job generation. Literally, if it's made here, it counts here, period.
But honestly, what GDP leaves out is just as important as what it includes. To keep this massive measurement accurate, we only count new, final goods. We intentionally throw out second-hand transactions, so selling your used car doesn't count, because that value was already recorded back when the car was first built. We also ignore non-productive financial transactions and intermediate products. Why? Well, it's all to avoid the classic trap of double counting.
And tracking a basic woolen suit perfectly illustrates this concept of value added. Let's trace it. We start with, say, $40 of raw fleece at the farm. Then the fabric supplier works their magic and adds $110 of value. The manufacturer jumps in and adds $150. Finally, the retailer adds $120. If we just blindly added all those sale prices together, we'd think the economy grew by way more than it actually did. By tracking exactly what gets added at each specific step, we reach the true final retail value of $420. No double counting, just the precise value added to the GDP at each individual stage.
Okay, moving on to section 2, the circular flow model.
Right, before we get into the flow diagrams, we absolutely have to nail down a fundamental distinction: flow versus stock. Think of flow as a rate of change over time, kind of like your weekly grocery spending. Stock, on the other hand, is a fixed quantity measured at one exact moment in time, like looking at your bank balance right this second. Everything we're about to explore is a flow. Picture it like water running continuously through pipes, not just sitting still in a tank.
Now imagine our economic machine stripped down to its absolute bare bones, a basic two-sector model. Money flows continuously from households over to businesses when we buy stuff in the product markets. And then that exact same money flows right back to the households as wages, rent, and profit in the factor markets. It's just this continuous closed loop of spending and earning. But let's build this out into reality, into an open economy. Now we introduce things called leakages. This is money stepping out of the main flow, like household savings or taxes. But we also map out the injections, right? The government pumps spending back in, and foreign economies get involved through imports and exports. The machine gets way more complex for sure, but that fundamental continuous flow, that stays exactly the same.
Up next, section 3, the expenditure approach.
What's totally fascinating to me is how economists can take that massive, tangled flow diagram we just mapped out and boil it down into a remarkably simple mathematical formula. The expenditure approach calculates GDP just by adding up all the spending for final goods over a set time period. That's it. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M.
Let's break down those dials on our economic dashboard, because each one has a very specific job. C is household consumption. That's all of us spending on services, durable goods, and everyday stuff. I is gross private domestic investment, which is businesses building future capacity through capital goods and inventory. G is government expenditure. Think public purchases and infrastructure. And finally, X minus M is net exports, which is literally just our exports minus our imports, giving us our international trade balance. To put this into a real-world perspective, think about Australian data from the 2018 to 2019 period. If we break down how these components stack up, household consumption completely dominates the whole thing. Actually, scratch that. It doesn't just dominate. At over $1,000 billion, it drives more than 56% of the entire nation's GDP. It's wild to think that every time you buy a coffee or get a haircut, you are personally fueling the single largest engine of the national economy.
All right, section 4. Let's pull back and look at global comparisons and alternatives. When we compare international numbers, like taking a snapshot of 2018, the massive economic skills of the US and China just absolutely dwarf everyone else. The sheer gap in the numbers is staggering. But while GDP is definitely the heavyweight champion of economic metrics, it isn't the only way we can, or even should, measure a country's success. It definitely has its blind spots.
And that is exactly where alternative metrics come in to fill those gaps. For example, net domestic product, or NDP, takes GDP and subtracts capital depreciation. Basically, it accounts for the reality that tractors and bridges wear out over time. Then there's gross national income, or GNI, which tracks income flowing to a country's residents globally, regardless of where the stuff was actually made. And gross disposable income tweaks that even further for overseas net transfers. Together, these give us a much richer, holistic picture of true national wealth than GDP ever could on its own.
Finally, Section 5, Heuristics and Human Impact.
So the really critical question we have to ask ourselves now is this. Behind all these multi-trillion-dollar figures and tidy algebraic formulas, how do everyday, flawed human minds actually process these complex economic realities? Because at the end of the day, the economy isn't just a spreadsheet, right? It's people.
When we're faced with complex uncertainty, stuff like inflation rates or job market chaos, our brains don't just naturally run perfect macroeconomic models. No way. We use mental shortcuts called decision heuristics. Two huge ones are anchoring and availability. Anchoring is our tendency to lock on to the very first or most recognizable piece of info we hear. Availability is when we overestimate how often something happens just because we can easily think of a familiar example, like assuming the entire tech industry is crashing just because your neighbor's startup went under. These shortcuts mean we often make highly biased economic judgments based entirely on what feels familiar, rather than the actual raw data.
And this human impact goes way deeper than just making bad bets. Zooming all the way down to the ultimate labor goal of full employment, we run into a really tragic concept called unemployment hysteresis. Basically, this is the phenomenon where current actual joblessness permanently shifts the baseline unemployment rate of the whole country. Put simply, the longer unemployment stays high today, the higher our accepted normal rate of unemployment is going to be tomorrow.
So why does this permanent scarring happen? Well, first, there's a literal reduction in skills when you're out of work for long stretches. A worker's abilities just naturally degrade the longer they are off the job. Second is the insider/outsider phenomenon. People who are unemployed for a long time eventually turn into outsiders who struggle to re-enter the labor force, even when the macroeconomy completely recovers. They literally get left behind by the very formulas we use to track our overall progress.
Which brings us to our final thought for today. We've zoomed from a massive national GDP formula right down to human psychology and permanent labor scarring. And honestly, it leaves us to wonder, if our macroeconomic is so heavily driven by flawed mental shortcuts and permanently scarred by very real human joblessness, can we ever truly capture the reality of our world with a simple mathematical formula? Or is our vast economic machine at the end of the day just human nature in disguise? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope it changes how you look at the numbers around you.